Across the land, in every major city and every small town, you will find numerous examples of libraries. Libraries, the ultimate repository of knowledge. Knowledge that comes in the form of books and periodicals and other publications that we believe and will use as reference and research material to prove a certain point. However, libraries may have a completely different story to them. Libraries may contain forbidden information that we are not supposed to access, and libraries may also play a strong role in the cultural building blocks of our current civilization. Let us explore and indulge in libraries. We begin by examining the quintessential library of Alexandria, Egypt. Supposedly, this was a library from the classical antiquity, representing the Hellenistic culture, the mix of Roman Greco civilization, and all the wondrous achievements that they had. In Alexandria, Egypt, it was known for its unique, one-of-a-kind lighthouse and the Library of Alexandria. There are many images and depictions giving us the example of the quintessential classical city, perhaps a city where there were mixed cultures and different aspects of society that gave it what people call the cosmopolitan appearance. And indeed, the story of Alexandria has actually touched our esteemed channel's scientific contributor, and he'll be delivering a little speech on it here. We have numerous renderings of what this library looked like, and we find this library an appealing sign of civilization because we believe that within its walls it stored numerous volumes, books of information that give us an objective account of the civilizations that preceded ours. And no doubt this is one of the fundamental building blocks of our society and how we justify our existence and who we are, because we know, or we believe, that the books and the publications stored within these great libraries are things that are objective. However, we tend to forget that an account, such as the burning of the Library of Alexandria, can be altered. Perhaps we do more research and we find out that the library was not really burned, but it eroded over a period of time. We have limited accounts from supposed contemporary sources that indicate that the library in Alexandria existed, and yet we're dependent upon over 1,000 years passage of time to document that it existed. Let us suppose that the Library of Alexandria did exist exactly as we're told, or perhaps it's even greater than we could even imagine. Why is this such an alluring story of this ruin of a building that appeals to us to this day? We're told that had this library survived and had its focus on knowledge continued, that humanity would have advanced much faster than it did, that this could have been a progression into the modern age, and it could have happened much earlier, perhaps in the 5th century as we currently measure time. These numerous images of this library give us the impression of great knowledge and learned individuals who know exactly what they're doing and made great scientific advancements. However, we're also told that their scientific advancements didn't reach the greater population, and as a result, many people had no awareness of what was going on in this incredible library. Consider the fact, though, that if this edifice did exist exactly as we're told, the amazing interiors. We can't really document the actual existence of the library in terms of a physical location. We supposedly have ruins that exist to this day, and we have some scattered accounts. What I find interesting, though, is that the very study and the story of this library does show us the true challenge in trying to examine history. What it's safe to say is that the perception of history changes with whatever religious, societal, or economic factors are in play at the time when one is studying history. It's certain to say that the perception of what the reality behind the existence of the library in Alexandria is predicated on the fact that you may have certain forces that wish to have a certain story or a certain outcome told. For example, suppose we are currently living in a society that tends to have more of a male-based society. Then certain aspects of the female contributions, we expect them to be suppressed. Or if it's vice versa. We don't exactly know what the true account is because we're reliant on people who had biases at the time to record it. We're also reliant on governments that we're told are corrupt and had numerous issues to store and transmit this information to us. So how do we know for certain that the information in this library is really an objective account? How do we know that the information in any of these libraries is truly an objective account? Now, this is the more negative connotation with libraries. There is a more positive connotation. Consider if it were possible to transmit some aspects of an objective account, technological advancements, and even more so, the discussion and description of a society that existed in true balance. The destruction of the library in Alexandria, Egypt was a very dramatic moment, and even though it may have been supposedly disproved by history, it's had a profound effect on our channel's scientific contributor. Yes, I was wondering when you were going to let me speak. Oh, go ahead, Carl, it's all yours. Thank you. I was wondering when you were going to give me a chance to speak. Alexandria was the greatest city the Western world had ever seen. Scholars, traders, and travelers congregated in the great harbor of Alexandria, and they exchanged information. In fact, this would be the first example of a cosmopolitan city. This is where we could say that people became citizens of the cosmos. But unfortunately, there were many religious zealots around at the time who did not appreciate the great learned advancements that the library and the scholars studying within it could offer the society at the time. And there was no one to stand up to prevent the Library of Alexandria from being burned to the ground. This was a great tragedy and a loss to all of humanity, because without these technological and scientific advancements, we were forced to wait another 1,000 years before we could actually achieve what we're supposed to achieve, and that's by reaching for the stars with our technological advancements. We consider the example of Hypatia, one of the great leaders of the library, and how she, as a woman in a male-dominated society, was able to flourish and ascend to a position of authority and technological advancement in a time when it was not proper for women to do so. Unfortunately, Hypatia was seen as a threat by these religious zealots at the time, and they rapidly descended upon her and the library, flaying her alive with shovels and then burning the library to the ground. This was a great loss to humanity. We can prevent this from happening now, though. We have to remember the story of the burning of the Library of Alexandria, and we must never let it happen again. Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Carl, for joining us. And yes, the story of Hypatia is very intriguing, as in reality, well, consider whatever you want on historical accounts, but in the 20th century, it seems as though they refined what actually happened with the library and the story of Hypatia, in this movie portrayed here by Rachel Weisz. It's interesting to note that the Library of Alexandria was said to have eroded long before Hypatia came along. But she was still a leader, and I find this artwork from the 19th century interesting, depicting Hypatia. Once again, a not-so-modest work of art from the 19th century, showing a woman in the full nude, much as the Soldiers and Sailors Monument in Des Moines, Iowa. However, Hypatia did exist, I believe, but I don't believe that she represented some sort of reference to classical antiquity. I believe that Hypatia, whatever she actually looked like, whether it was Nastasia Kinski or Jada Pinkett Smith, was someone who was a survivor from previous civilization, and that she attempted to preserve knowledge, along with her father, Theon. Hypatia and Theon were survivors of a previous civilization, and they legitimately were trying to preserve the records of that civilization. Yes, Theon. No, not that Theon. I think we have a better representation of what Theon, Hypatia's father, really looked like, and he's titled as Theon of Alexandria. Ah, that's better. Well, in any event, we have no idea what either one of them looked like. However, I think their deeds are what really tell us who they really were and what they're really about. And this goes back to the reference of what the library was. Official history says that the library was already eroded by the time of Hypatia. So the original edifice and the functional institution had long eroded. Now, who knows if that's true or not, because I find it interesting that when Carl Sagan gave his little presentation on Cosmos, he was quite certain that the library had existed and that Hypatia was actually one of the leading scholars in the library, if not the lead scholar. Consider how extraordinary this library must have been if it existed and it really was a surviving relic of the old world or the civilization that preceded ours. We also talk about adding or subtracting 1,000 years from the official timeline, and the account of this library, and even Carl Sagan himself in Cosmos referring to this, reinforces this notion that it's clear that there's a lot of alteration in time. There is a library in Alexandria, Egypt today, and this is what it looks like. And of course, we see the finest modern architecture that inspires our wonder every time we look at it. And yes, my sarcasm meter is turned up to 10. I wish we would have had more of a documentation of what the real library actually looked like, and why am I so certain that it existed? Because this is one of those touch points in history that we don't seem to really let go. And if there's something that we don't let go, then there's an indication that some aspect of what we're told in the account is true. I don't believe anything is completely fabricated. It's always an alteration of the truth. This library did stand as an example of a pre-existing civilization, and Hypatia and her father Theon were survivors. Imagine what this library looked like in its fullest glory in the previous civilization. Aspects of information storage and recording that we can only begin to imagine. We're limited to the concept of both Theon and Hypatia and what they passed on to us, and yet there are accounts that they had access to advanced technology, such as an astrolabe or a star chart that we'll look at a little bit later. So what exactly was going on? Was Carl Sagan exaggerating a little bit? Was Carl Sagan pulling our legs in this account? Or was he pulling his own? I think there's an aspect of it that is true, because Carl was quite convinced that it was true, and he seems to genuinely believe what he was saying in his account in Cosmos of the Library of Alexandria and the story of Hypatia. We do have records of other great libraries across the land, and there are many great libraries that existed in the Islamic world and many that still survive to this day. Regardless of what the exact architecture appears like, the function appears to be the same. That they preserved knowledge, and that this knowledge was stored in the form of books, or scrolls, or many other aspects. Compare and contrast that with when we looked at the Tartaria Rises video, when we had isolated monasteries, or what we're told were religious settlements, that may have been surviving settlements during an apocalyptic era, brought about by a previous reset. And there are numerous examples of that across the land as well. There's even accounts of very extraordinary structures and depictions of such that may have survived initially the reset, and then were targeted by the powers that be for their destruction. And it wasn't just the destruction of the buildings, it was also for controlling the information. Because as the saying goes, if you can control the past, you can control the future. If people don't have an understanding of what their true identity was from a previous civilization, and you're able to erase the great libraries of Constantinople, Alexandria, and countless others across the land, then instead of having people who are actually relaying objective information, as is depicted here, what you have are people that relay a controlled account, and then it simply becomes a matter of repetition, and suddenly that controlled account becomes the good word, and there is no denying it, there is no debating it. It's doing good research. And this goes back to the research fallacy that we talk about on this channel quite frequently. You have to count on the fact that the people at the time preserved the knowledge objectively. You also have to count on the fact that that knowledge was translated and passed on through countless generations, countless governments, and this is going off the official account, and that somehow it reached us objectively. That what we're reading is the true account. And yet we know, as an incontrovertible fact, that that is not true. That every account, that every perception of any account can be changed depending on the morality of the society in existence at the time. Consider all these images that we have of these unbelievably large books. These raise many more questions when we see these images of these large books. How could these even be useful for storage of information and passing down to subsequent generations? There are many theories about why we have such large books, and there's certainly no shortage of the number of them. So you can't really say that they were produced as some sort of novelty. We also have other accounts of scrolls, tapestries, and parchments from many different eras that supposedly communicate to us exactly what was going on at the time. There's even the famous historical account of how the Irish monks saved civilization by preserving knowledge. And of course, it's a great contradiction in our historical account that we're told that religious zealots destroyed the library in Alexandria and murdered Hypatia, even though we're also told that the library eroded long before Hypatia came along, and that she was simply someone who represented a school of thought that looked towards classical antiquity and wanted to represent it in a time of diminishing intellectual prowess. Whatever the true account is, though, we can't easily explain the fact that we have all of these large books that don't really make a lot of sense. Why do you think we have so many large books? Are we just all into this novel construction of things that don't make sense and have any practical use? Let me know in the comments. It's not just large books, though. There are many other facilities for storing and transmitting information through the time. The challenge becomes translating the language, and then, as we said earlier, depicting what really happened in the current society at the time. It's safe to say that a society that controls the civilization that it exists in will be very careful about what actual information is transmitted to its civilization and the people that reside in it. I mean, you can't have people getting wrong ideas of a pre-existing civilization that don't fit into the current time. And of course, it's always justified. We're well aware of this consciously, and oftentimes we just go along with this without any sort of question about what's really happening. Sometimes it's difficult to question an account that's given to us because there's the saying that people love a good story. And I'll admit that I'm guilty of that myself. I enjoy a good story, and it can oftentimes lead to an emotional upheaval when someone questions that story. Yet it's being able to overcome that emotional upheaval, which is what enables us to do objective research. And it's how we can achieve an existence as a true balanced individual. A balanced individual who's able to consider what the true account of our past really was, and not a biased or subjective account, because that's what we tend to find. We also have to remember that if we go off of our official historical account, this is all we have is many different biased and subjective accounts from many different eras. Many of these works do exist, and there are hard copies that you can find and you can reference to this day, and you can attempt to translate them. But you have to remember that you're going through many different second and third-hand sources of information. You're also going through many different means, many different apparatuses that are in existence to try to interpret exactly what you're reading. So it becomes very challenging. In fact, would you be surprised to know that the largest bookstore in the world is located in Iran, a nation that we're told is large into censorship. Well, fortunately, we're not big into censorship in the Western world, right? I was surprised to learn this fact, and yet at the same time, it's one of those conflicting accounts. The account of Andrew Carnegie, our great steel industrialist and philanthropist from the United States, one of the original robber barons who, once he was finished suppressing labor movements in the 19th century with the Pinkerton Detective Agency, decided in a bout of altruistic amity to devote his funds towards building libraries not just in the United States, but across the world. And we can see many examples of these great libraries that Mr. Carnegie built, and this one's actually in Edinburgh, Scotland, which was somewhat surprising to me that this was where the earliest Carnegie Library is located. There are others located all across the land, and they have quite an interesting architectural styling to them. It is suffice to say that virtually every one of these Carnegie libraries is what we would define as an old world building. And wherever it is, whether it's in Scotland, the United States, New Zealand, or wherever else across the land, there's even some that we see in Spain, we see the same stylings of architecture. Here's the one in Spain that we see in other classical old world buildings. Of course, we'll simply be told that this was merely a reference to neoclassical construction at the time, but these buildings are not easy to explain given the architectural and logistical capabilities of the late 19th century when all these Carnegie libraries were supposedly constructed, and some in the early 20th century as well. But you see the same architectural stylings on them, and it's interesting that Carnegie's name is affiliated with thousands of buildings across the land, not just the United States. And as you explore this in depth, you will find that the libraries are not just on public lands, they're also with universities, and even with government installations. It's as though there was no limit to where this Carnegie plan actually went to and what buildings it provided for. And when you look into this account, you'll see it's justified by this wonderful photo here of Andrew Carnegie himself, and they're laying the cornerstone. Remember when we used to have accounts of laying the cornerstone for building an incredible building? Well, just imagine a cornerstone laying ceremony for thousands of these buildings. A viewer asked me a few weeks ago, where was the first Carnegie Library planned in the United States? Oddly enough, it was in Iowa, Fairfield, Iowa, the model for the 2,700 Carnegie Libraries worldwide. What is it with Iowa? It always seems to come up in these old world explorations, and it's more than a coincidence that the foundational template library for the Carnegie Libraries was in Iowa. Even though the first one was also constructed in Edinburgh, Scotland, it was based on this model. Nice owl there. And we always see that the owl and the griffin seem to be symbols that appear on these buildings quite frequently. I'm sure that is just another coincidence, but we know what they really represent. Fairfield, Iowa is the county seat of Jefferson County, which population never exceeded 17,000, and they built this really gnarly courthouse in under 3 years. Because once again, such achievements were quite simple in the logistical limitations of the 19th century. In fact, they even managed to put a bell tower on this one, and a little Statue of Liberty, which seems to have been replaced by, I don't want to say a cheaper model, but maybe we'll say a more expeditious model. And finally, we consider the film The Name of the Rose, a film which revolves around a secret library on an isolated monastery during the medieval period, or even the latter portion of the Dark Ages. The story concerns the adventures of William of Baskerville, portrayed by Sean Connery, a Franciscan monk, and his novice Adso, portrayed by Christian Slater, as they arrive at an unnamed monastery in northern Italy to participate in a theological debate between the Franciscan order, an order of the Catholic Church that believed in poverty, against the forces of authority in the Catholic Church itself and other religious orders about the employment of poverty and if the clergy, in other words, the administration of the Catholic Church, should be impoverished. It's based on the book by Umberto Eco, and he was supposedly inspired by this great monastery that exists to this day. And as you can see, the basic construction techniques of medieval times were employed in this monastery. It's also easy to imagine how one could be inspired by such a location. Yet at the same time, one could see how such a location could survive a reset, and it full well could be a center for learning. What the film The Name of the Rose really depicts, though, is a time of fanatical religious faith that overcomes the learned inclinations of William of Baskerville. William of Baskerville is a fictional character, but he is based on a historical character, supposedly, William of Ockham, famous for the saying, Occam's razor. In other words, the most simple explanation tends to be the most correct. However, just accepting the most simple explanation without asking questions kind of defies the principle of true objective learning and research, if there is such a thing. The film depicts many incredible scenes of old world buildings, and it does some great on-location shooting. What happens is, once William of Baskerville and his novice Adso show up at the monastery, they find out that there's an unexplained murder, and the abbot of the monastery wants William to investigate, as he's well known as an intellectual, the abbot pictured to the right here, portrayed by actor Michael Lonsdale, and F. Murray Abraham portraying Bernardo Gui, a member of the Inquisition. You also have one of the esteemed members of the monastery, the Honorable Yorgi, who seeks to repress the intellectual pursuits. He also doesn't appreciate people laughing because he finds that if people laugh, then they no longer have a need for God in their lives. So you can argue that this film is the classic depiction of religious zealots that are preventing the objective search of knowledge. Another interesting aspect about this film is some of the sets that were constructed. The library itself is hidden in a great labyrinth in the monastery. Now, while there's a lot of location shooting in the film, the Great Labyrinth had to be constructed as one of the largest sets seen since the film Intolerance and other great set Hollywood films. There's difficult and conflicting accounts, though, but we can see that the set exists, and here's a map of what the labyrinth of the monastery looked like. And once again, I'm drawn to the conclusion of considering that these monasteries really did exist, and they really were some preservation of the old world of the previous civilization. Now, did they have to be overcome by the forces or the authorities that be to ensure that the correct information was transmitted to the current population? I believe that there's a very strong case to be made for that. And you can actually find a lot of that hidden within the plot of both the film, The Name of the Rose, and the book by Umberto Eco. It's an intriguing concept, though, the search for knowledge and what it really represents, and many of the challenges that we face. We see that William of Baskerville values the books more than people in some cases, and yet by the end of the film, he's made a little bit of a character arc, and he values people even more than the books. There's even an astrolabe depicted in the book, and Hypatia was said to construct these as star charts. William of Baskerville used it, and it's actually used to condemn him as a heretic by Bernardo Gui, the church's representative of the Inquisition, played by the ever irascible and capable F. Murray Abraham. You might remember him from the film Amadeus, as Amadeus's arch nemesis Salieri, the other composer. When you watch the film The Name of the Rose, you'll have references to how the monasteries could have been used to preserve knowledge from the old world, and how that knowledge was challenged. How much of it could reach us objectively? Let us suppose that there were objective accounts that were recorded in books or parchments, and that we had some means to translate them to contemporary times. Do we assume that everything that we translate is objective information, or it's biased in some way, shape, or form? We have to assume that even from such a great civilization, the information could be biased. Consider this aspect. Des Moines means of the monks. Consider that Iowa seems to indicate that it's a preserved Old World region. And that would be the origin of the name Des Moines, as I've been asked that many times. What monks in Iowa? Well, if you think about it, if there was a pre-existing civilization and there was a settlement somewhere that was of monks, it suddenly makes perfect sense. It could just be a coincidence, but then there's a lot of coincidences in these explorations. We consider the actual heights and ascendancy of the civilization that preceded ours, and it seems like it's some sort of dream in science fiction. Yet at the same time, we're told in our official account that the achievements of Rome and Greece and the Hellenistic period were considered science fiction to the unlearned minds of the medieval period. So as always, make of it what you will, but we can look and see with our own eyes that there were great achievements that previous civilizations had made. You can't exactly attribute the star formation, star forts, star cities, to the limitations that we're told that the medieval period supposedly had. We'll be examining how an objective account could have survived. Carl Sagan himself posits that there was an Encyclopedia Galactica. Now he was talking about aliens and other worlds, but the reality is there could be an actual remnant of some form of the internet, if you will, from a pre-existing civilization. There could be some sort of surviving software program, or dare I say, even some form of artificial intelligence that could have existed from the previous civilization and survived for our current civilization to access. We're going to be considering that in a subsequent exploration coming soon called Looking Glass, the Ultimate AI. Well, I hope you enjoyed this look at libraries and forbidden knowledge. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
History is full of people who, out of fear or ignorance or the lust for power, have destroyed treasures of immeasurable value